If we were to be on a jury trial together, this is about what would happen. Let's pretend that we're on this jury and man one is accused of murdering man two. Now, here's the problem. We don't absolutely know for sure if man one murdered man two or not, because we didn't see it with our own eyes. The only way you can know something for sure, 100%, is you have to see them with their own eyes. So as a jury, what the judge is going to tell us is he's going to say, you're going to have to examine the evidence, and you're going to have to use reason, and you're going to have to ask the question, what is the most reasonable explanation for what happened? And he says he's going to tell us that we're supposed to come to reason. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. Do you doubt that this happened beyond reason? If so, you need to let this guy off. But if there's enough evidence that beyond a reasonable doubt you believe he's guilty, you've got to convict him of being guilty. We'll never know 100% for sure. We've got to reason it out, come up with a reasonable explanation. Yes, this is what makes the most sense, and we make the decision from there. And so what would we look at? Eyewitness testimony, DNA testimony, evidence from fingerprints, crime scene analysis, all that kind of stuff. And then we would look at all the information and we would make a decision from there. Well, I have found that when I talk to people who say, I'm an agnostic or I'm an atheist, and we're asking the question that, well, how can I know there is a God? And they say, well, I don't know there is a God, or the atheist says, there isn't a God. How do you engage them in a conversation? And what I want you to know from the very beginning is the vast majority of the evidence now through science points to a creator, the existence of God. So I just want to take you through the material that I have discovered, and I'm going to point you to places that you can discover it as well. But I also want to take you through a process of how I have this conversation with non-Christians. So what I say to my friends who say there is no God or I don't know, I say, let's do this. Let's put God on trial. Let's put God on trial. Let's treat him like the guy accused of murdering the other guy. Let's be the jury, okay? And we're going to look at all of the evidence, and then we're going to see what evidence makes sense. What would a reasonable person come to the conclusion based on the evidence? And in a sense, since you're an agnostic or an atheist, I guess you're the prosecuting attorney. And I guess since I believe in the existence of God, I'm the defense. And so I would love for you to go first. Just tell me, what evidence do you have that shows that God doesn't exist? Give me the evidence, okay? Now, most people, 99% of the people are going to say, well, I don't really have any evidence. That's just what I believe. Well, some people are going to say, well, it's the evidence of the fossil record and evolution, and they're going to give you some scientific stuff, and that's great. I hope you do have some evidence for what you believe, because this is a really important question to get right. And so I want you to have evidence, because I'm going to show you my evidence, and my evidence is overwhelming for a creator. And in fact, I believe that any reasonable person, after looking at the evidence, is going to admit and that there is a God. But we just want to put God on trial here, and we want to look at the evidence. And so that's literally how I start conversations with people who are agnostic or who are atheist. I just say, let's put God on trial, and let's see what the evidence says, and then let's be reasonable people, and let's come to the conclusion that reasonable people would come to. Let's don't make the decision based on emotion or based on what we've always believed, or no, let's just let the facts lead us to the conclusion. And what I found is, and I'm just going to tell you this up front, out of every 10 of these conversations I have, about 7 people don't want to hear the facts, they don't want to have the conversation, they don't want to open up their minds, their hearts are hard, and they're not interested. But I'm also going to tell you that the 3 out of 10 that say okay, about 3 out of 3 of them come to Christ. Because when someone begins the search for authentic truth, it leads them to Christ every time. And so that's just what I have found in my heart to be true over time. Okay, so let's just start and let's just talk about Darwinism, atheism for a little bit, and then I'm going to give you one argument for the existence of God. And then next week's video, I'll give you a couple of other arguments, and it'll probably take us either 2 or 3 weeks to get all this material. But if you'll listen to every one of the videos, by the end, the evidence is overwhelming for the existence of God. So let's just begin with Darwin, and let me just comment on a couple things, okay? If you are going to embrace Darwinism, evolution, and the underlying premise of naturalism, evolution, that everything that has happened in this universe, all the stars, the sun, our solar system, the universe, Earth, people, the complicated universe that we live in, happened by accident. Naturalism, it happened naturally. There's no supernatural involvement, okay? Here's what you have to believe. These are the underlying assumptions you have to buy into in order to buy into evolution. Okay, number one, nothing produces everything. Nothing produces everything. Listen to this. Naturalistic processes have utterly failed to explain how non-living chemicals could somehow self-assemble into the first living cell. There are no explanations or theories by evolutionists on this topic. They simply don't know. So I want you to hear this. If you're going to believe in evolution, you have to believe that nothing produced everything. Well, the first thing that they don't know is they don't know how nothing came into being some chemicals in the first place. They just don't know how that happened. Okay? Now, Darwin himself in his book said the original particle was God. God created the original gases, the original chemicals, and then evolution went from there. So even Darwin was not an atheist. Darwin was a believer in God. He said God created it, and then evolution took it from there. Evolutionists have no idea, they have no explanation. Where did the original gases, where did the original chemicals come from? What happened to them? And the only possible answer is creation. Evolutionists have no idea how that came about. So you have to buy into the fact that nothing produces everything. Second, you have to buy into the fact that non-life produces life. That non-life produces life. That somehow, remember what we're talking about here, these chemicals that were non-living chemicals somehow morphed over into a living molecule, a living cell, that non-life somehow jumped the barrier over into life. Now here's what biochemist Michael Denton observed. He said the idea that undirected processes could somehow turn dead chemicals into all the extraordinary complexity of living things is surely no more nor less than the great cosmogonic myth of our times. In other words, what he's saying is, this is simply impossible. To assume that dead, non-living chemicals could somehow come together and make the jump and become a living cell is preposterous. In Texas, we used to call that hogwash. It's just not going to happen. It's impossible. Evolutionists have no answer to the question, how did non-life produce life? So they don't have a question for how did the first particle or chemical get created or come into being to form the Big Bang, which started evolution. They don't have that answer. Number two, they don't have the answer of how did these dead chemicals jump over and become living chemicals to create life? There's no answers, not even any theories on that. They don't know. You have to believe that randomness produces fine-tuning. That randomness produces fine-tuning. And yet, that goes against so many scientific principles, specifically the second law of thermodynamics, that says all things go from order to chaos in a closed system, and that you have to have something come into that system, an outside source, to breathe life into that system, or everything is going from order to chaos. To believe that randomness produces fine-tuning, that chaos leads to order, goes against everything we believe in science. And yet the theory of evolution says you're going to go from randomness to fine-tuning. We're going to go from chaos to order. It's simply not going to happen. It goes against the scientific laws themselves, because everything in this world is going from order to chaos without external stimuli changing the ecosystem of that particular environment. Okay. Next, you have to believe that unconsciousness produces consciousness, and this is going to be a huge piece of evidence that we're going to look at either next week or the week after. The whole idea of consciousness. Can you imagine now that we're talking that non-living cells could somehow self-assemble and make the jump to be a living cell? Now we're going to talk about living cells somehow make the jump into being animals that are conscious, that have instinct, and then the craziest jump is that they can jump from literally just having instinct to fully conscious human beings that can reason and think. All of those jumps are absolutely impossible. And evolutionists have no explanation for those jumps. And to think that non-consciousness, unconsciousness, produces consciousness is simply untrue. It's simply impossible, and there's no evidence to back up that could ever happen. And then finally, along the same line, you have to believe that non-reason produces reason. That animals running off instinct suddenly become fully functioning human beings that are fully capable of reason. And so if you're going to believe in evolution, if you're going to believe that there isn't a God, that all this thing happened by naturalistic means, then that's what you've got to believe. Okay, so I'm going to reread this to you just so you get it. Okay, you have to believe with all your heart. You have to believe that nothing produces everything, that non-life produces life, that randomness produces fine-tuning, that chaos produces order, that unconsciousness produces consciousness, and that non-reason produces reason. And I'm telling you, that is unreasonable. That is unreasonable. And I'm going to show you proof and data over the next couple of videos that's going to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt as a jury that this is ludicrous and that there's a much better explanation, i.e. God, for the existence of our universe. Okay? I want to say one more thing before we move on, and that is the whole idea of Darwinism and the fossil record. Okay, the fossil record, first of all, is there evolution that goes on? If you're talking about evolution, or can I call it adaptation, within species, absolutely. You see it in nature all the time. We are created by God to adapt to our environment. For example, humans are inches taller than we were 300 or 400 years ago. We're bigger than we used to be. You can find all sorts of animals in nature that they end up, growing a bigger beak if it's a bird so they can catch fish. Animals that change their coat over time to deal with the cold of their environment. Of course, you see evolution, but it's always within species. There's nothing in the fossil record. There's nothing in the fossil record that indicates any sort of jump between species. And in fact, it's interesting to me. Here's what Denton says. He says, the intermediates have remained as elusive than ever. Rather than harmonize into a case for Darwin's theory, the fossil records sabotage the leaps that Darwin's theory must account for, such as fish to amphibians or amphibians to reptiles. So what is Michael Denton saying? Michael Denton is saying if you look at the fossil record, here's what you find. All the mammals basically came into being at the same time in the fossil record, and there's no fossil record that is showing us jumps from amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to mammals. There's no evolution between species in the fossil records. There's evolution within species. But the specific species all kind of came to life together around the same time in the fossil record. So the fossil records do not back up the theory of evolution. There is no fossil record that shows, that reveals that evolution between species. There just simply isn't. And guess what? I don't believe there ever will be. Here's what Darwin said. In his chapter titled Difficulty with a Theory, Darwin says, to suppose that the human eye, with so many parts all working together, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd to the highest degree. So we have taken Darwinism to a place Darwin never meant it to be. Darwin said God created the initial particles. And Darwin said, you know what, this is a theory, but I have to admit that if you look at the complexity of the human body, let's just look at the eye and the complexity of the eye and everything that has to happen in the eye to see. He said, I admit my theory is absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And many scientists today are now saying, you know what, all the evidence points to a creator. And I'm going to show you those evidences over the next week or two. Okay? I want to now transition over, because when you look at evolution, when you look at Darwinism, these things you have to buy into are so unbelievably, well, let me put it this way. It takes a whole lot of faith to be an atheist. You have to believe that processes that go against our basic scientific principles actually happened. And that is very, very improbable that would have happened. Okay? Let me give you a couple of books to think about. I would encourage you to go buy a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This is a book by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. Great book that talks about some of these things. I would also encourage you to buy Lee Strobel. He has books called The Case for the Creator, The Case for Faith, and The Case for Christ. And it really helps you. He does all the research and becomes kind of an editor for the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of research that shows the fallacies of evolution and the truth of creation. And it's fascinating to see what those things will be. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you one of 4 arguments that I'm going to give you, or proofs, for the existence of God. And it's one that comes out of philosophy. And I'm going to share this one with you, and then we're going to call it a day, and we'll come back next week and deal with the scientific proof within physics and astronomy. Okay? So this first one is called the ultimate cause argument. And it's the argument of, why does the world exist? And it goes something like this. The moment things exist, we're going to ask why things exist. So one of the core questions people ask is, why am I here? What am I doing here? How was I formed? Was I formed by accident? Was I created? Or am I just a bunch of cells that came together and formed into what I am? Okay, how did I get here? And the moment something exists, it requires an explanation for why it exists. And in philosophical terms, this is called sufficient reason. So what is the reason we are here? Okay, so here's how this argument goes. Everything in this universe is contingent or dependent on everything else. So I want you to think about the whole universe. Just think about this world. Think about the world as a big hula hoop, a big giant hula hoop. And everything that exists in this world is dumped inside this hula hoop. And everything inside the hula hoop is contingent or dependent on everything else. So for example, human beings. We can't survive without other things. What do we have to survive? Food, water, clean air, oxygen. Okay? The whole global warming issue is over what? We are contingent upon our environment, upon this world in order to survive. And the people who are buying into global warming and saying, boy, there is a lot of climate change going on here. Why are they so upset? Because we're contingent on our environment. We're dependent upon that. And if we don't have a clean environment, we're a generation or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 away from this place being uninhabitable. And because we're contingent on our environment, we will die. We will cease to exist. So we've got to pay attention to this. Okay? And there's all sorts of examples in nature. I want to give you one from a while back in Yellowstone National Park. The gray wolf was taken out of that environment. Okay, so you think about, there's these micro environments within the whole world environment. Okay, so Yellowstone National Park is an ecosystem. And this ecosystem is perfectly aligned by God in the way He created it. And the top of the food chain in that ecosystem was the gray wolf. And the gray wolf feasted on deer and elk, and the ecosystem worked very well. Well, a few years ago, the gray wolf left Yellowstone National Park. They were killed, and some of them left, and so there was no gray wolf. Because there was no gray wolf, there was no one to eat the deer. There became too many deer, too many elk, and that just had this domino effect down the ecosystem all the way down to the grass and the weather, and things completely changed in that ecosystem. And so scientists literally came in, went up to Canada, kidnapped some gray wolves, took them back down to Yellowstone National Park, reintroduced them into the ecosystem, and over a few years, the ecosystem balanced back out in Yellowstone National Park. Why? Because everything in creation is contingent upon every other thing. Now remember, I told you about the second law of thermodynamics, and that is within these ecosystems, okay, the ecosystem is always going from order to chaos. That's a scientific law, unless there's an outside source brought in. When you think about an ecosystem, what's the outside source? Weather, rain. The weather patterns are the outside source that keep the ecosystems running. And so that's why we're so concerned about weather patterns and global warming, is because that is the outside source that keeps the ecosystems from decaying into chaos. And if you take out that weather, if you take out rain, everything burns up and dries up. Everything goes away, because you have to have that outside source or everything dies. Everything dies. And that's the way it is in the entire world and universe ecosystem. Well, here's the question, and it's a philosophical question. What makes more sense? If you take the hula hoop of the ecosystem of the world and the universe, where everything is contingent upon everything else, everything is dependent upon everything else, does it make more sense that all of this came from a source within the hula hoop, within the ecosystem, that is also dependent, that is also contingent? Or would it make more sense that outside the hula hoop is a source that isn't contingent, that isn't dependent, that is totally independent, that is eternal, that can exist without the codependency and the contingency of everything in the hula hoop? Which makes more sense to you? And most people, reasonable people, will say, well, it makes more sense for something outside the hula hoop than something dependent and contingent within the hula hoop to be responsible for everything that has happened. Well, if you agree that that is true, you've just come up with your first initial working definition of God. God the Creator, eternal, self-existent, independent, non-contingent, that creates and sets this entire world, this entire universe, the ecosystems of this planet and this entire universe in place. And now everything else is created, dependent, contingent. And our responsibility, to be honest with you, to keep the ecosystems working correctly, and it's God that oversees that whole process. So that's argument number one. Not the strongest argument I'm going to give, but something for you to think about. So here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to think about what you have to believe, the underlying things you have to believe to buy into evolution. And then I just want you to think about this first argument. I just want you to think what makes more sense. Something contingent being responsible for it all, or something outside the hula hoop being responsible for it all. And then we're going to come back next week, and I'm going to begin to show you now the evidence of science that basically has deemed Darwinism and evolution, it's turned it upside down. It simply is not the reasonable explanation for the existence of everything that is in our universe. So let's pray. We'll call it a day. We'll come back next week and take this up. Father, thank you for our time together. Lord, I pray for everyone watching this video. that it makes sense to them, that you open up their minds to see the truth that you are the eternal, existent God that created the heavens and the earth. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Have a great week.